Hi, my name is Matt Redham. I'm the School and Community Wellness Advisor for Butte County Office of Education. In this video today, I'm going to talk very briefly about what to watch for as kids re-enter the learning environment. I don't say go back to school because our current reality is that we will primarily be doing distance learning, and we will be experiencing our kids sort of in a virtual environment. So I want to talk briefly about what little we know about what to pay attention to, what are we watching for as far as kids probably doing fairly well, and as far as some kids that might not be doing so hot. And then also maybe talk about when we do return, we are face to face with kids, what should we watch for? I want to preface this by saying that, I don't think at any time in my professional career have I felt so woefully underprepared to answer certain questions. There was a time in many of our lives after working with kids for years and years and years like we had, where somebody might ask us a question about, how do we know if a kid is doing okay? And we have a laundry list of answers. And I know for myself that our template for this current situation, a global pandemic that results in our community, our schools, our way of life sort of changing and slowing down or stopping or shifting. Now, we don't really have a template for that, right? So even as functioning grown-ups, I think about any sort of comparison I might have to this situation, and I don't have one. And what that leads to is really every experience we have during this shutdown feels a bit like a new experience. So when we think about children and we think about how is this impacting kids, what should we expect when they return? What are some things that we can do to ensure that we have a relational connection to them and that we have a sense of how they're doing? That could be much more challenging in this environment. So in this video today, I just want to talk very briefly about some of those very things. And I want to do so with stating clearly that this is new to all of us, and that there is no panacea, there is no exact right answer, there is no sort of set of things that if you do it or you think about it, you're going to have a really good handle on kids. But we do believe there are some aspects of how children will take in this experience. There are some things that we know and have known about how they were doing prior to the shutdown and what that might tell us about how they're going to return back to school, and just typically what we know about kids developmentally. So let's start with how kids might be experiencing this event. So one of the things that we know is kids will interpret things in vastly different ways. And the way they interpret it depends on their prior experience, also depends on their developmental level. So the way a 4-year-old perceives this current situation and the way a 10-year-old perceives this current situation is very, very different. And the way a 16-year-old interprets this situation is very different. So age is a big piece of that. Developmental level is a big piece of that. The other thing is the filter in which they're receiving messages about what this is, right? So if I, as a parent, I have an 11 and an 8-year-old sitting to my right, and they are interpreting this situation. They are experiencing the shutdown based on a whole host of things. Some of the things I mentioned, their previous experience of disaster or of life change. But they're also experiencing it through my experience. So my experience of this situation is being filtered down to them. And so they're taking cues from me with respect to what this is, how dangerous it is, how safe it is, what it means. And that provides them some basis for understanding what's happening. So we can look at some different things that sort of add to a child's understanding of the situation. That understanding then is going to impact how, for example, they access their education, they show up for their virtual lessons, and it's going to really determine to what extent they're able to cope with this situation. So when I think about children and I think about children's experience of COVID-19, it's very hard to say, well, these kids are doing this and this and this and this. However, we can sort of make some broad categorizations. One of them is if a child really struggled prior to the shutdown, and they struggled because of a combination of factors, which might be, things at home weren't always super safe. They might have had parents that were highly stressed or working a lot. So the supervision might have been not so great. We also have kids that, let's be plain, that in this county whose life at home is just flat unsafe. Those kids are our greatest concern during COVID-19 because we know that school was one of their safe havens. For us as the system, or as folks that were caregivers for these kids, we oftentimes were the safest individuals in their life, or we at the very least provided the most routine and predictability. When we look at returning, even in a virtual world, one of the things we have to think about is what we call relationship mapping. We've also called it in the TRSS work, our trauma responsive systems work, sort of a tree of concern or a red flag system. When we look at a tree of concern, when we look at that relationship mapping, what we are doing is we are saying, here are a list of all the kids that we have. Maybe they're a list of kids coming into my class. Maybe if I'm an admin, here are the list of kids that are attending my school. And you really go through and you just sort of say, how well do we know this kid? Very well, not so well, not at all. How concerned are we about safety for this kid? Well, we might not concerned at all, moderately concerned, very concerned. But overall, we want to get a sense and a picture collectively as folks that not only admin, but teachers, folks that are going to be interacting with these kids. Who are the kids that we have concern about? And that we have those discussions, we have some sense of who those kids are before we enter into the learning environment, so that we can front load our contact with that child and with that family. Then we have a lot of kids who sort of fall in this middle place, that their experience of school prior to the shutdown was probably not bad. It might have even been great. And I love school. You might have some of those kids who really didn't love school so much, and the break sort of felt like a relief to them. But you have a large number of kids who sort of fall in this category of, we don't have, high concerns about their safety at home. They did probably fairly well. They were sort of average before the shutdown. And we wonder to ourselves, what has their experience been since the shutdown? We'll be working on 6 months of, not really seeing these kids. So when we think about these kids, now we start to have a really broad range of how children are doing. And we also have a really broad range and a difficult to access sense of, have they been okay? Have they not? And those are the kids that we really want to make sure we are being creative and thinking about ways that we can pay attention to them, engage them in a way that continuously assesses their ability to let us know how they're doing. That is very difficult in a virtual environment. So what I mean by that is, typically, if children are sitting in front of us and they are with us day after day after day, there are some indicators that a child is struggling. Those indicators can be their behavior. That's oftentimes the most obvious indicator of how a child is doing. The other can be what they tell us, right? So they might be telling us that they're not feeling okay. They might be visiting the counselor and letting the counselor know that they're not feeling okay. They can show us, so they can show us through art sometimes, or they can show us through other aspects of emotional expression. But by and large, it's a combination of all of these things. So if we're looking for depression in children, for example, when they're sitting in front of us, we're not actually looking for a kid that's sort of just, well, at least in school age kids, K through 6, K through 8, we're not looking at kids who sort of are lethargic and have their head down and look sad. We're actually looking for kids whose social behavior changes abruptly. They might isolate a little bit more. And we're also looking at irritability, right? We're looking at, sort of response to situations that seems a little more extreme than it was. Anxiety, for example, if a child is right in front of us, we're seeing a child perseverate on either, their grades or friendship issues. They might have worries that have to do with the outside world that are pervasive and sort of invade them. And for these kids, you oftentimes have like a flight response. They might leave the room a lot, or they might have difficulty concentrating. They might report that their heart's beating really fast. So even in the best of worlds, when we are standing in front, we are trying to teach kids, it can be very difficult to know when kids are not doing great. But we do have strategies, and we do have things, especially socially, that we look at that we can say, hey, I think this kid might need some extra help, or I want to reach out to the counselor or mental health professionals just to see how this child is doing. When we're in a virtual environment, that can be very difficult because we don't necessarily have access to moment-to-moment behavioral data, emotional data that child is giving us. So we have to rely on sort of alternate methods of assessing how a child is doing. So one of the ways that we can do that is through their chat. So if we have access as a teacher to maybe they have a Google chat with their friends, or maybe that they have a way of communicating through our distance learning method that we can assess, we can look at, are they engaging with their peers? Are they engaging with their peers virtually? That can be tricky too, because just because a child isn't engaging with their peers virtually doesn't necessarily mean they are struggling. But when we look at, did this kid, this student struggle before? Am I having a hard time contacting them or their parents? Are they showing up sporadically for lessons? Are they not necessarily getting work done? We're really going to look at engagement, right? The ability to engage as a key component of how that child's mental health and wellness is doing. Now, it's not the only component, because there are all sorts of issues why a child in a distance and learning environment can't engage. Access, technology, scheduling, availability of parents, they might have to be working. There's a whole host of things. But we have to be willing and able to sort of look at the whole of the child and begin to assess, like, of all these things that I'm seeing, do they indicate that this child might be struggling in some way? One of the most clear ways as we enter a distance learning environment is when the child reaches out for help. So they might reach out for help in a peer, they might reach out for help to us as a teacher, you as a teacher, they might reach out to help as a counselor. It's my feeling that if a kid in this current context is reaching out for help, that we take that as a sign that they really, really, really need that attention in that moment. And we should really make every effort to hook them up with some sort of external support, depending on what they're reporting that their issue is. But in this environment, I think it takes a tremendous amount for folks to reach out and say, hey, I'm not doing well. And that includes kids as well. So if a kid is reaching out and they are saying, hey, I'm not doing so great, we want to make sure that we absolutely follow up with that as quickly as possible, and that we ourselves are aware of some of the supports that are available. Butte County Behavioral Health is transitioned to all virtual work, and they have space to see kids who are on Medi-Cal. There are also local agencies that are continuing to see kids for counseling and mental health supports, and there are also many individuals within the community who do private mental health support that are continuing to do that work as well. One of the things that we've talked about a lot during this process is the importance of social emotional learning, and how social emotional learning for kids needs to be prioritized, especially in this setting. I think when we are talking about how kids return, in whatever form that is. We're gonna first maybe talk about returning distance learning. So they're accessing their education through technology, and they're not sitting right in front of us. That we know, given what they have been through, given that some of these kids also went through the campfire prior to this, that their access, this on a very basic level, their ability to engage in the way that is optimal, meaning they're engaging with all cylinders firing, their attention is there, the situation is set up so that they can absolutely focus to their best ability, individual to them. We don't have that right now, right? We don't have that by any means. Even if we didn't have the fire occur prior to COVID, and we were just dealing with the impact of COVID, there is very little evidence to suggest that kids will be able to resume their academics like nothing happened, and that they will be at sort of an optimal level of focus, optimal level of learning. It's a mistake to assume that kids haven't learned through this process. But I think it's also important to realize what they have learned might be different than what our association of learning typically is. We know kids have learned, and we know kids have learned academically, but primarily what our kids have been learning is how to navigate, how to negotiate a novel situation that is stressful. And as kids are able to do that with support, it actually creates a tremendous amount of growth, a tremendous amount of neuronal growth, sort of neuron growth and brain growth, but also social growth and also personal growth for these kids. So they're going to enter into these virtual environments, some really ready to learn, some kind of ready to learn, some really not ready to learn academics. But the slower we start that rigor, that academic rigor, and the more we utilize social and emotional learning techniques to build relationship within a virtual environment, to have routines and rituals that weave in us checking in with the emotional state of each kid, that is only going to help us down the road. So the longer this stretches out and the longer we're in a virtual environment, the slower we start. Slower meaning that we really focus on that relationship building for, the first week or 2 weeks, the better off we're going to be, because we're going to have a better sense of how to communicate with that child in a reciprocal way. How are you doing? How are we doing? What are the ways in which we're assessing how we're doing? Using things like a mood meter, using things like a morning check-in, lunch check-in, and then bookending that with a check-out can be really, really helpful, because relying on just visual cues of how a kid is doing, relying on just parent contact, relying on just sort of what the teacher the previous year might have known about that kid, although those things are incredibly helpful, we want to set up touch points throughout the day where we are checking in with kids and kids are checking in with us with respect to how they're doing. So we also want to provide, to some degree, some context about what we're all experiencing. That context about what we're all experiencing is really important, because many of these kids have had this experience filtered through a whole bunch of different perspectives. And so some kids might be very afraid due to what's happening. So they might be afraid for their own physical health, their own physical wellness. We have other kids who their experience might be that this is just kind of like, this is just dumb, like we should be back. And as professionals, we sort of recognize that as kids, they're going to hold a variety of different views. But our overarching message has to be, here's generally why we're doing this. We want to keep each other healthy and safe. We know this can be difficult. We want to make sure that we're contextualizing what's happening fairly regularly, explaining it in developmentally appropriate language, and then also validating whatever experience those kids are having. Some kids might be having experiences that don't make sense to us. They might hold views about this that we may not agree with, but I think it is important that us as caregivers provide a backdrop of validation a backdrop of whatever they come with, we can say, hey, that, you know what, that makes a lot of sense. It makes sense that you're confused about this. So some of the things we want to look for in addition is, the ability to focus might be dropped. There might be an increase in inattention in kids, decrease in their access to that really sort of regulated, smart, planful, looking at the future and saying, I want to do this, this, and this. The access to that might be diminished, which would make perfect sense. There's going to be an increased need for reassurance, even for kids who don't appear to need reassurance. And reassurance can just take the form of, hey, you know what? We're all going to get through this. We're getting through this. Things are going to be okay. If you feel like you can't get through this, here's where you can go. And then have that list of resources, have the counselor available to kids as well. They're going to have an increased need for processing, especially when we return to in-person, so that there will be that need for them to process. A lot of times if you have something sort of in you, in your head, in yourself, in your body, that you don't entirely understand, and it's a big event like COVID-19, until you have a chance to sort of sit and process that, either through art or through talking or through experience or through movement, oftentimes it's going to get in the way of learning because it's going to keep popping up. And we all have had that experience as adults as well. And they're going to have an increased need for clarity. We may have to repeat very simple directions over and over and over again. And this would make perfect sense. So what I want to leave you with is to know that you're going to have kids that are really engaging in a much different way than they've ever engaged. Usually, we have a pretty good sense within the first 2 weeks of the makeup of our classroom, the types of kids, sort of the social dynamics, who's going to engage, who's going to need a little more space, who's going to need a little more time and attention. And that's going to be really, really hard this year. One of the hardest things is assessing and looking for signs that kids aren't doing well virtually, but also that all of our internal states are going to be elevated, right? We're all going to be a little bit tuned up because this is so different. We're all going to put pressures on ourselves. And so when we build into the flow of our day with kids, time for all of us to just stop, even if it's for a minute or 2 minutes, and say, how are we? We want to make sure as adults we're joining in that conversation as well, that we're able to say, hey, here's how we're doing. Here's how I'm doing. How are you doing? And that provides for us modeling of walking the children through what it is we're dealing with. We're modeling processing. We're modeling transparency. So we want to pay attention to our own wellness at the same time as we're paying attention to the wellness of kids. So I truly believe that although sometimes it can feel very ambiguous, and I think it will feel very ambiguous, having a sense of where our kids are at, we need to, in a virtual environment, take into account more factors than we would if we were sitting in front of kids. We need to fill out and have a sense of that tree of concern or that relationship mapping as a starting point. We need to have in our head some things that we want to pay attention to if we have some concerns about kids, like how are they engaging? Are they engaging? What is the parent report that they're doing? Have they dropped off and had a lot less contact with peers? Are they not contacting peers at all? And that's a sign that we may want to reach out to that child, reach out to that parent, and connect them with some outside services. So I want to wish everybody not luck as we move into this next phase, but I want everybody to rely on everything that we have learned as a community. Rely on your own resilience because it's tremendous given everything we've been through. But also don't hold yourself to such a high standard that you feel you can just keep going and going and going. Build in breaks within the flow of your class, build in times for check-in, and carve out space after class time to debrief and decompress for yourself. I truly hope everybody stays healthy and safe, and I look forward to talking to you again. Thanks.